Hello, I'm Craig Enser.
Nice to meet you.
Patrick Grigsby has graciously allowed me to interview him in his lovely house, and we'll talk about his life, his family, Mersin, Turkey, and his memories.
Yes.
He's the author of a book, and that's how I got to know him. So, A Life Apart, The Fate of an Outsider by Patrick Grigsby. So, my first contact was, a book by an English guy who lived in Mersin, and I thought, that's a bit strange. So I had to buy the book. So I got to know Patrick through the book. So maybe we can start by talking, what made you write this book in the first place?
Difficult to say. I felt that there was a story in it somewhere, and I felt that having come to England and settled and got married and set up my own business, that there was so much to think about in the past. And I'm told that I tend to live in the past, so I suppose that must have had something to do with it as well. And of course I've got 8 grandchildren, and it's something to leave for them, for better or for worse, and that's about it.
So how long did it take you to research and write it?
The research was minimal, because most of it was from my own personal experiences and from my own memories. The writing of it probably took about a year, something like that.
Okay. And it came out about
It came out at the end of 2010.
2010. Okay. Only 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So let's get to know more about you, and you can tell us maybe where you were born, about your parents, and then we can go deeper into your ancestry from then onwards.
Yeah. I was born on the 27th of December 1931 in Port Said. Port Said because the connection there is the sea. My father was a master mariner, and at the time he was working for the Khedivial mail line, and he'd met my mother actually in Mersin, because the ships that he was captain of always called in Mersin, Istanbul, before going round the coast to Egypt. And it was a very old friend of my mother's who was instrumental in introducing the two of them. Somebody called Victoria Atalay, who comes from a well-known emigre Syrian family in Mersin called Butros, the Butros family. So that's really how it all happened. They were married, funny enough, neither in Mersin nor in Egypt. They were married for some reason in Beirut, and the only connection I can think of is that my great-grandfather and his wife are both buried, General Rickards are both buried in Beirut, but I doubt if that really had much to do with it.
But he would have been dead by then, right?
Oh yes.
So perhaps there was still some property going, or some base of some sort?
There has always been a good connection between the descendants from my great-grandfather Rickards' first marriage to an Egyptian woman. He had 7 children with her, and my family, the Rickards family in Mersin, who were descendants from the second.
Loads of cousins and second cousins.
Oh yes.
So we almost like a clan, and the common thread is this mixture of the Britain and Arabic and Turkish type thing.
It, yeah. And the other interesting thing, of course, that binds me even more so to the Middle East is that, like my great-grandfather who married an Egyptian woman and converted to Islam, my own grandfather came to Turkey in the 1890s.
So this is from your mother's side. This is you talk about
my mother's side.
Yeah. Okay. So good. We kept the word grandfather. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Before we get, because that's quite a complicated picture,
Yes.
let's first deal with your Irish side.
Yes.
How much do you know about your father, where he was born, his parents, and why he chose to become a captain? Do we know anything about that?
Very little. Very little. My mother and father were married in 1927, and it was a very short-lived relationship because he was sadly drowned off Beirut in 1934.
Like an accident sort of stuff?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So,
It's very, yeah, and that's how you basically ended up in Turkey, because
yes,
you had to go to your mother's homeland, shall we
that's
say.
right. My mother was left with myself, age about 3, by then living in Alexandria, and she simply could not have continued living there. She had no resources, and in those days even the ship's captain had very little security in terms of pensions and so forth. So she returned to her own family in Mersin, and I grew up in my grandparents' home.
Have you done any research to find out more about your late father?
Very little. I knew that he was Irish. My mother used to always explain that's how I came to have my name Patrick. And my mother had kept some photograph albums of his first wife. He'd been married previously.
Right.
And I have a half-sister who's living in Canada, or was living in Canada. And looking at a lot of the photographs in these albums, the photographs were taken by his first wife, who was a nurse. A lot of photographs of Catholic churches and cathedrals and so forth. So it occurred to me that although he was an Ulsterman, it occurred to me that he probably did not have any strong feelings as between Catholicism and Protestant faith. And that pleased me because I then decided to tell people that he came from Cork, until somebody that I met recently, who was from the south of Ireland, found it difficult to believe that somebody with the name Grigsby
All right. It didn't quite match.
would come from Cork.
Right.
But my father, his initials were W.H., William Henry. And the other thing that also stuck in my mind as a child is that he was never called William, because that would have strong Protestant
William of
connotations.
Orange.
William
Sure.
of Orange, you see.
Right.
And he was always known as Harry, so that also pleased me. But I will come to something else later on to do with my best man, who was an Irishman.
Right. Okay. Now let's deal with your mother and her background, family, and how you remember her and when she died.
Yes, I was brought up really in a single parent family. My grandparents, my grandfather, the son of a General Ricards, was extremely Victorian in his outlook.
His name was?
Henry Ricards.
Right.
Henry Rogers, H.R. Henry Roger Ricards.
And he was born in Egypt?
He was born actually when my great-grandfather, General Ricards, lost his Egyptian wife. He returned to England and settled in Sydenham, where they had a substantial property house.
Right. And
he married Catherine.
An English lady?
English.
And then later he went back to Egypt?
And no, well, I think he'd have had difficulty going back to Egypt, having renounced Islam.
Oh.
So he went back to Beirut.
Right.
Beirut at the time was part of Greater Syria.
But you don't know the reason why he went to
No.
Beirut?
These are all assumptions on my part.
But presumably he missed something about the East.
Oh yes.
He probably found England quite boring.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. He must have been quite an adventurous type of person.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I would almost go, well, it isn't my choice of phrase, but it has been said that General Rickards was really a soldier of fortune.
Was he a real general? I mean,
adventurer.
his name is Abdullah Pasha. Was he a real military general, or was that like bestowed upon him?
He was military. His background was certainly military. I'm led to believe that his earliest military experience was in Portugal, defending Queen Dona Maria, and he was under some British colonel. They were all really
Was that Civil War?
professional soldiers.
Was that the Civil War in Portugal?
I'm not sure if it might have been the Civil War. There was
Right.
a lot of unrest at that time.
Because this is after Napoleonic times, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So he had that experience and came to Egypt. As regards his being called general, in a directory, military directory that I've seen, he's described as a general in the Egyptian service.
Right. And that's his portrait there.
That's a portrait of him.
Okay.
Um,
Do we know who painted this?
Yes, it was painted in London, and I have the address of the studio where it was done, somewhere in Bond Street, I think, or Regent Street, and it was done just prior to his getting married to his English wife,
Which is this
Which
one.
is Catherine.
obviously. Right. Okay.
And it was said at the time that Catherine had come out to Egypt to look after his Egyptian children and give them an English upbringing.
Oh, so they might have met in Egypt
Yes,
before he came to England.
Yes.
Okay, so
that is what is believed.
right, but we don't know much about
No,
her.
very little.
Her maiden name or anything like that. Do we know her maiden
Well,
name?
yes, her maiden name, funny enough, was Rickards,
Oh.
because she was the daughter of Henry Selby Rickards' older brother,
So
called
they were
Prido
cousins.
Selby Rickards.
So they're cousins.
She was his niece.
Oh, okay. Well,
And I have a cutting from...
how interesting. Okay.
Yes, I have a cutting from the London Times of the day,
Right.
explaining that they went through, and the phrase used is a form of marriage, which of course is not recognized in the church.
The Church of England does not
No, no,
recognise you marrying your own niece, of course.
That's it.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Now tell us about this medal.
This is a Mejidia. It's a Mejidia medal that was given to him by Abbas Pasha, who was the Khedive.
Abbas Hilmi.
Abbas Pasha.
So he was effectively the autonomous ruler of Egypt, normally under Ottoman control, but
That's
pretty
right.
well independent.
That's it.
And he brought a lot of Western technocrats and
Right.
army people
Oh, yes.
to build Egypt
But-
using the profits of the cotton and
That's it.
stuff.
Yeah.
But of course it all ended in tears
Yeah.
because Britain
And-
eventually Britain took over Egypt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is also a fact that my great-grandfather, who came to be known in Egypt as Abdullah Pasha, was also made the first Director General of the Egyptian State Railway. At that time, a line that ran from Cairo to Alexandria and back from Alexandria to Cairo.
So presumably he made quite a bit of money. I mean, this came, it brought advantages, presumably, right? It was not just symbolic, was it?
I did go out to Egypt, to Beirut, in fact, not to Egypt, to Beirut, where I was looked after by Robert Fisk, who was a Middle East correspondent at the time of the Independent newspaper. And we did quite a lot of research together with his help, with Robert Fisk's help. And it's believed that he had quite a substantial property, both when he was in Egypt and then later on when he returned and settled in Beirut. But unfortunately, all the archives were destroyed during the civil war in Lebanon. So
Right.
we didn't have access to them.
But there might be some archives possibly in Egypt.
But might, yes.
But of course, accessing them is
Yeah.
not going to be easy.
I have tried through the Egyptian embassy in London to find something out, but
So, presumably he had a nice villa
yes.
outside Alexandria,
Yeah, yeah.
and maybe another place as well.
Yes, Cairo.
And of course, all that is now lost, you could say.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So there might be more research to be done there.
Well, yes, but a cousin of mine who's actually Egyptian Muslim, Nuha Sadek, she's a stickler for research, and her notion is
Right.
that you've got to have proof, definite proof, in other words, written documents, and it's very difficult to get hold of this.
Well, of course,
sort of
I mean,
information.
today's Egypt is quite chaotic,
That's
so
it.
I hear you can't actually walk in many parts of Cairo anymore. It's
Oh,
just,
probably.
yeah,
I
so,
don't know.
so maybe for another day, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, going back to Henry Salvi Rickard,
Yes.
I suppose it's all conjecture why he left England and how he ended up there. I mean, do you have any clues, or is it just pure guesswork?
Well, the family, he was born actually in Colchester, and so was his older brother.
So a military garrison town
Yes.
type thing.
But I haven't been able to find anything at all out about his education, nor his military training.
But those records should be easier to access, presumably.
Well, I've been down to Kew,
Mm-hmm.
to the not statistics, to the
The archives office.
archives.
Yeah, National Archives.
And I've spent a lot of time, but I haven't been able to come up with anything worthwhile.
But of course, his military career was not with the British Army, it was with the Egyptian Army,
Egyptian
so
Army.
it's not quite the, of course, same thing.
That's it, yeah.
Right. Okay, so now let's look at this picture here. And this, I believe, shows your late father and your late mother.
Yes.
Where was this taken, this photograph?
This, I would imagine, would have been taken in Egypt, probably in Port Said, early on,
So
when
it-
they first married.
So the brand new, of course, they lived only short. They were married just for 4 years or 3 years?
From 27 to 34, 7 years.
7 years. Okay, right. So. And when did your mother die?
My mother died actually in Sutton Coldfield about 30 years ago. now,
Okay.
Yeah.
So
And
she lived quite long, huh?
Yes.
Right.
The family grave belonging to my grandfather, Henry Rickards, and his wife, Mariam, is in the big cemetery, the new cemetery in Messine. And it's alongside the grave of Dr. Matheny. Dr. Matheny was an American doctor of theology running a mission school that my grandmother had been to. She was only 16 when she was married to my grandfather.
Right. So your grandmother already spoke English before.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And of course, your mother spoke English fluently.
Yes.
So there was no. The home language was English through all the generations.
Well, the language was English, except for the fact that my mother and grandmother, when we were alone together cooking, which is a tradition in the Middle East, everybody likes to cook,
Right.
spoke Arabic.
Right. Was that the same Arabic as in Arabia, or was it
No, it's
certain
the Syrian,
brand?
Syrian Arabic.
So the Mercian Arabic is the same as Syrian Arabic, right?
That's right, because most of the emigres to Turkey in the 1930s, well, before the 1930s, starting at about 1840, came mainly from Syria, Iraq and Egypt.
Right. And I suppose in Mersin you had a three-way population. You had the old Turkish population, you had the Arabs who
Yes.
came through the 19th century,
Yes.
and then you had the Europeans probably came a bit later.
That's right.
And I suppose the Arabs and Europeans mixed more than with the Turks. You had this sort of, did it have layering, shall we say, in terms of business and stuff?
Well, yes. I think it was really driven by commerce, commercial interest and activity. Most of the Europeans, which were predominantly Italian, Greek, French, and some German.
Levante,
Lochner, and so on.
Yeah, the Matas.
Yes, and Tahinji, they were Greek, big Greek family.
And
But all in all, people mixed. And I think it was really the language that united them. So anybody who spoke Arabic would mix with the poorer emigres that came from the Arab world.
do you speak Arabic?
Yes, well I spoke it a lot better than I do now.
Right. I suppose
I've had precious little practice.
Sure. But you haven't forgotten your Arabic.
No.
That's nice.
Turkish, French and Arabic. Turkish, French and Arabic are the three languages spoken in that
So,
part.
Mariam was the wife of your grandfather.
Yes.
What community did she come from? What family did she come from?
Her family were builders. Her father was a master builder called Hanna Karroum, Kerroum. Right.
They come from Syria originally.
Right, originally, yes.
Right. Okay.
It's not, we're told it was either Latakia or Aleppo.
Right. And your mother's maiden name was?
My mother's maiden name was Ricards.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So, William was your uncle.
Yes.
William Ricard.
Right.
He was involved in business, I believe.
Yes.
In Marseille.
Yes.
And he was a Lloyd's agent.
Yes.
How well do you remember him?
I remember him very well because in a way he was like a surrogate father. But the tragedy, the sad thing about it was that he remained a bachelor all his life. He never got married. He had a very traumatic early childhood as well. He was sent to school, first of all in Wales, to Llandovery College, and then from there he went down to Battersea Grammar School, and at the beginning of the 1418 war, when he was still underage, he volunteered, like so many people did in this country, to go with the expeditionary force to France. And he was in both battles of the Somme, Ypres, Passchendaele, and luckily, in a way, he wasn't even wounded, but it had a very profound.
So when he came back, he was a changed man, huh?
That's right.
Yeah. But he carried on working in business, right?
Oh yes. After he came back after the war, he spent a year in, I think it was actually in Larnaca, in Cyprus at university. And then he had various businesses, including a sawmill, because the Mersin region, Mersin, Tarsus, Adana, southeastern Turkish region, was very, very expert and very successful in producing fruits, vegetables, and so forth. And what we discovered as time went on is that the prices of the stuff that we were shipping to Ankara, Istanbul, Izmir were lower in Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir than they were in Mersin.
So how did that work? Yeah.
Well, the Turkish merchants who wanted to profit, properly from their produce, found a better market in these big towns. The population, of Mersin was only about 20,000.
Right.
And of that 20,000, roughly half were Christians, mainly Maronite, Greek Orthodox, and Catholic. There were 4 churches in Mersin at that time, in the 1930s, and only 1 mosque.
Wow.
Yeah, very, very. It was quite a unique.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine today.
Yeah.
Right. You went to the high school in Istanbul,
Yes,
I believe.
yes.
Presumably there were no such facilities in Mersin.
No, no, no. The only foreign school in Mersin really was the one run by Dr. Matheny. And then later on, by some other American missionaries, a college in Tarsus.
Right. That's about 70 kilometres away, I think.
Sorry?
How far away is Tarsus?
Oh, Tarsus is only about 15 kilometres.
Oh, that close,
from Mersin,
okay.
yeah. We used to
Right.
go, it was a favourite place to go
So-
because of St. Paul.
Right, so rather than Tarsus, you decided to go to Istanbul, or your family decided?
Yeah, I decided to send me to the English high school.
Because
in
it's a
Istanbul.
higher status.
Yeah. It was very, very well regarded by the Turkish population because it provided what we like to call aile terbiyesi, family
Discipline.
discipline and so forth.
Morals.
Much more so than the French, Italian, Greek.
So the British were the strict people when it came to education there.
Well, they were regarded as such, yes, absolutely. And,
The times
and I
have
think
changed.
in those times they were.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, did you identify yourself as British or Arabic or?
I regard
or
myself.
Turkish?
I regard myself, to be honest with you.
But back then.
Back then I was very British because when we had one of the first radios in the town, and my uncle used to always listen to the BBC, and of course we used to play God Save the King or God Save the Queen as it happened. I used to always stand up and salute, but
What a child picture. Right. So, you lived in a big extended household in Mersin. Did you live with your grandparents?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
And was that until they died? I mean, or until you left for Istanbul? Or?
No. It was my grandfather died at the very beginning of the war in 1939.
Right.
My grandmother lived on for a good few years after that. The house was really occupied by my grandmother and grandfather, my mother and myself, virtually all the time. My mother had two other sisters, Rosie, who married an Italian from one of the Levanti family, and another sister called Olga, who married the acting British consul called John Catton.
Right.
And she moved from Mersin, and of course the one married to the Italian family moved in with the Italian family at the time.
So, did the family have any other property in Mersin or area?
Yes, my grandfather had an impediment. He'd had polio as a child and was paralyzed down one side. So he didn't really work as such. He's described, in fact, on some documents, his profession as being gentleman.
Right.
So he invested in property, and the properties were built by Hanna Karoum, his father-in-law, who was a builder.
Right. Okay. So it's a good job the family had this real estate to
Yes.
provide the income. Presumably, your uncle's business was not sufficient to provide for the entire extended family.
Well, I couldn't say, but the fact of the matter is, I was always reminded, and I used to hear this in conversation at home as a child, that we have got a fixed income, we live off rents.
Right.
And they were very fortunate, really, because in the 1418 war, my uncle was, as I mentioned earlier, in France, but my grandfather, though not a combatant, was with the expeditionary force in the Dardanelles, with the Anzacs,
Right.
as an interpreter. And when the war ended, my uncle returned from France, and my grandfather also came back to Mersin. All the properties, both in the town and also in Gözner, where we had a summer house, were handed back intact, including all the contents. and we Turkish authorities there were very, very
Decent.
decent.
So now I'd like to talk a bit more about the war years. So
Yes.
how did the war, Second World War, affect Mersin? Do you remember?
The war affected the residents of Mersin, but particularly I think the emigre people in Mersin, very, very dramatically, but in an indirect manner. I mean, none of them were combatants, none of them were involved in any way, shape or form, but in their businesses. Most of the shipping agents, people dealing with transport and so forth, were involved with either Italian or German, and maybe some French lines as well.
So business got cut off completely.
Yes, although there was a good deal of business going on because, of course, Turkey was neutral. So provided the ships could get through the minefields or the whatever, they were coming to Mersin, and of course in those days Turkey depended much more than they do now on European imports, medicines, plastics, even things like knitting needles, a lot of stuff was being imported still.
Right. Okay. And can you sort of briefly talk about this European community?
Yes.
Presumably some of them were there for a short time, some were there for generations.
Yes.
Some names you already mentioned, like Levante.
Yes.
And
Levante, the Nakash family were very much involved in shipping.
the Nakash were
Ibrahim Nakash.
the Arabic origin?
Yes, of course,
Right,
yes.
okay. And there's a Lochner family?
The Lochner family, Mr. Lochner was involved with cotton.
Right.
He was an expert on cotton.
So this is a German origin
German,
family?
oh yes, German.
Right,
They
okay.
had two sons, both older than myself at the time. The younger of the two, Eitel, was killed on the Russian front,
Oh boy, right.
very tragically. And the older brother, Ronnie, ended up in Izmir and was known to quite a number of my friends of the Whitall, Giraud, Lafontaine families.
Mm-hmm.
So
And there was Maltas family, I believe, as well?
there was an Arthur Maltas,
Okay.
and that's about it. Alain Giraud's mother was married to Geoffrey Maltas, but that's all.
Mm-hmm. So, did you mention there was a military presence?
Oh yes,
in Mersin?
there was a big military presence, but of course as Turkey was neutral, it was officially not a military presence.
This is
They
British
were-
troops
Oh,
during
yes.
the war or after the
Oh
war?
yes, during the war.
During the war.
Probably about 1941, 1942.
There must have been some sort of deal going on there.
Absolutely.
High corridors.
The idea was that they were building roads, and in some cases widening roads. The idea being, so we were told at the time, that if there was any need to land aircraft, the roads could be used as landing strips. And they came as if from a very well-known Tipton civil engineering company called Braithwaite's. And they had a lot of parties, they were very sociable, they invited a lot of local people to these dues and so on.
Including your mother as well?
Oh yes, and my aunts and cousins and so forth. And they had strictly officers' mess and other ranks, you see. So the game was given away, but even more so by the fact that all the lorries and jeeps that they brought with them had desert camouflage. So anybody knowing anything
Straight
about
from the 8th Army, basically, yeah?
that's it, absolutely.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So you could say Turkey was not so neutral after all.
Well, Turkey was very, very neutral. and particularly so, I think, with İsmet İnönü. Some people used to wonder whether it would have been quite the same had Atatürk been around. But no, Turkey maintained neutrality very strictly.
Okay, so it's still a mystery why this British military contingency was there.
Well, yes, I suppose it was a mystery, but as I say, they were actually engaged in, building bridges and roads and so on and so forth.
Okay, but presumably there was another ulterior motive, shall we
Well,
say?
yes, I'm sure. The thing one used to always hear about in those times, I can remember from my own family, was talk about the Mosul oil fields and the big dread that if the Germans could ever get through, they would cut off the supplies to the Allies.
Right.
But as it happened, that didn't.
Because Iraq was semi-fascist.
That's it,
Okay.
yeah.
Right. What type of visitors came both to Mersin and to your household?
Yes.
Did you get professors excavating mounds or visiting
Oh, yes.
other dignitaries, shall we
Yes,
say,
yes.
and fleets, allied fleets and stuff?
Yes. There were quite a number of archaeologists, well-known ones, Professor Garstang, Sir Leonard Woolley, and a young man called Bill Bryce from Yorkshire. They were researching the Hittite dynasty in a hill which was said to be man-made, a man-made hill at the interior of the town.
The tumulus, right.
Yes.
Okay.
And
is it still there, the tumulus?
oh yes, of course.
Preserved?
Yes. Oh yes. Yumuk, it's called Yumuk Tepe.
Right.
Yumuk Tepe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you had a summer house
Yes.
in Gersner. Was that
Gersner.
rented or was that owned?
No, it was owned. All my grandfather's properties were owned by the family.
So this was sort of the cool air
Yes.
during the heat of the summer. You'd spend about 3 months there, something like that?
Yes, usually from about mid-June until about mid-September. When the first rains came, that would be
Right.
a good enough excuse to go back to the town.
So you must have had very charming childhood
Oh yes, it
experiences,
was.
adventures, running up and
Yes.
down.
It was very
hills and-
adventurous
Yeah.
and very primitive, but people were prepared to put up with this sort of privation just to be in the cool and be able to sleep at night. You see, in those days there was no air conditioning.
Did Mersin have malaria in those days?
Mersin, in common with many parts of that part of Turkey, had malaria, but this was dealt with by growing eucalyptus trees, which suck up all the moisture in any sort of...
so it drains the marshes.
drains the marshes
So
and so forth.
mosquitoes don't have the
Yeah.
swamps. Oh,
And,
okay.
the anti-malaria doctor was one of the notables of the town.
Right. Okay. What next? Yeah. You then decided to go to England. Was it because you couldn't find a job when you finished high school?
No. The decision to send me to England was not. I didn't have any say in the matter at all.
So it was forced upon you.
It was absolutely yes,
Right.
and particularly so I think by my grandfather, who was probably quite happy to see the back of me, because he wasn't very tolerant of young children.
Right.
And I was sent to Hurstpierpoint College in Sussex, and I was there for 4 years,
Okay.
and I didn't return home for 3 years.
So when you came back to Mersin,
Yes.
then was there a problem finding work for you?
Well, no, because when I finished at Hurstpierpoint, I was fortunate in being related to the Levanti family, who were very big shipping agents, and I worked in their office for a year. It could have been a lifetime job.
Like a shipping agency,
A shipping agency.
dealing with all the ins and outs.
Mainly cotton and pulses, you know.
So all the paperwork
Yeah,
to go with all the
that's it,
exports and
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
So did you get bored? Or?
No, we were never bored.
So okay, why did you go to England then?
Never bored.
You had your setup there?
Because there was in the office there was a Greek and an Italian, and though they were good friends, they hadn't forgotten the war,
Oh.
and they were always having little quibbles
Yeah.
about this, that,
Yes.
and the other. No,
Who
the
owns
thing is-
Rose type stuff?
That's
Yeah,
right.
Okay.
The thing is, I couldn't see a future for myself there, and fortunately,
Were you ambitious?
I don't know if it was ambition or if it was self-preservation. My family had entertained somebody called Jimmy Jimmy Rampton, that's it, from a company called Ruston and Hornsby's in Lincoln, who manufactured diesel engines and gas turbines and so forth. And he'd obviously been speaking to my family, my mother and my uncle in particular, about the prospects for a young person going in to serve an apprenticeship. And that's exactly what happened.
Right. So chance encounter, and your mother, and your grandfather decided this is the way to go,
That's it.
and you basically accepted.
Of course. I had no choice.
Okay. Okay.
No choice at all.
So did you go by boat all the way to England?
When I came to school in England in 1945 at the end of the war, I did so on a ship called the Franconia,
Right.
which had been converted into a troop ship, and I boarded the Franconia in Port Said, where I'd been staying with my aunt, who was sharing a summer house with an Egyptian cousin called Caesar Nabarawi. Caesar Nabarawi was one of the three Egyptian suffragettes.
Oh, a feminist.
Yes,
Egyptian feminist.
That's it, feminist.
Oh, okay.
So it was on the Franconia, and I had a
A berth?
not
A hammock?
a hammock, and it was quite a job getting into it.
I suppose it was full of these troops going back
Oh
to
yes,
England from
the Lancashire Fusiliers,
Okay.
the whole regiment.
So there's a load of Lancashire accents all around
Absolutely,
the
oh
area.
yes, yes.
But I suppose you were treated quite well by these
Oh yes.
older.
They
soldiers.
used to have duties down in the hold, where there was quite a lot of fruit, and they used to come up with oranges and tangerines and so forth, and sweets and so on. So yes, it wasn't bad at all, and I arrived in Liverpool, and somehow I managed to get on a train and ended up in, I don't know, one of the stations in London,
Yes.
and was met by one of the masters, who was the music master, Tregonning, a chap called Mr. Tregonning. And I was taken down to the school, but again, as luck would have it, I was a day or two early, because term hadn't started, so I actually lived with the Masons. Kenneth Mason was the housemaster and married with his wife.
So they helped you settle in, shall we say?
That's it.
Because
Yes.
obviously it was a culture shock, wasn't it?
Oh
Everything
yes,
about England
absolutely. Oh yes.
was so different to
Yeah,
nursing.
very, very different. And the school was very different. Although the high school in Istanbul was supposed to have been run on public school lines, I don't think they knew quite what public schools were really like. Very, very different.
So when you went to England as an apprentice
Yes.
of this firm,
In 1950.
was it with the intention of doing it forever, or was it just I'll try it and it might come back to nursing?
No. I had realized that I didn't have a future. You see, had Mersin, had Turkey been part of the British Empire, I'd have been ideal, because most public school boys were trained and coached as administrators
To
of
manage.
the empire.
Yeah.
And they were all like peas out of the same pod,
Yeah.
and they were disciplined and had to, work to the book. And I wasn't quite that sort.
Obviously you missed nursing though.
Oh yes, I miss my friends, I miss Mersin, I still do in many ways. But coming to Ruston's was a wonderful opportunity, and I was very, very well treated because I was put up at Lyndham House, which was really run like a club and was a place where VIPs were entertained and so on. And that's where I met my wife.
Oh right, of course, yeah. And of course you were at the time when Britain was still
very much so
forced to be reckoned with.
Absolutely.
And engineering was
absolutely
top. So,
yes.
But you saw the decline as well, right? So
yes.
Through your years, you probably gradually saw what Britain has become now. We can't manufacture a hammer anymore.
Yeah. No, it was very sad. It started, I suppose, I was there from 1950 to 1955 when we got married. And it was probably in the last couple of years. What was happening, you were getting countries like, for example, Greece, who would put an embargo on small diesels because we wanted to manufacture small diesels themselves locally in Greece. There was a big scheme, irrigation scheme in Egypt and the Sudan, the Geziri irrigation scheme, that was cancelled. There were a lot of things going. The idea was I was going to go and work for a chap called Percy Roberts, who was Ruston's representative, based in, of all places, Beirut. And he would travel around with agents and then periodically come to the UK for exchange of information and so on. But he resigned and started working for an American company. Nothing to do with diesel engines.
So again, a chance happening there affected your future, because you could have basically been based in Beirut long term.
Oh yes, I could.
Knowing Arabic as well.
I'd have hoped to come back to the Middle East and settle there for good.
Right.
But it wasn't to be.
Okay. But you maintained your connections and links with Mersin. And
oh yes.
So when was the first time you went back to Mersin after joining this company?
Yes. I couldn't tell you exactly, but I can remember very, very well one trip when I flew back and landing at Yeşilköy, as it was then called, the airport, and then catching the plane down to Adana. Very, very memorable because for the first time in quite a long while I was able to have Turkish cooking and Middle East cooking and so on. It was very, very pleasant.
Okay. Now going back to your book.
Yes.
Are you planning a sequel?
Yes, I've been thinking about the sequel for a long time. But trouble is knowing exactly where to start and exactly what to include. Because of course as time goes on, memories become more and more faded and people.
Sure. Well, that's one of the reasons why you wrote the book in the first
place. Oh yes.
If you had somebody with a magic hand who could help illuminate a part of the family history,
yes,
which bit would you like to concentrate on?
The family. I think I would prefer to concentrate on the Middle East, because I feel that sets us apart from many others. It's a rather unique experience. And I think also that it would make more interesting reading, particularly people living today as compared with what it was in the 1950s and 60s.
Do you know anything about the parentage of Henry Salvi Ricards?
I've tried very, very hard, including my cousin, as I have mentioned, Nuha Sadek, to find something out about him. What we have found out is how little my grandfather, who was his son, knew about him when I was growing up in Mersin in the 1930s and 40s.
They just didn't talk about him.
Exactly. I think in those days people didn't, particularly Victorians.
Right. Okay. And of course there's no stack of old letters or no diaries or anything like that?
nothing.
Okay. So let's finish up with this picture here. So I'll get closer to the camera. Would you like to describe
Yes.
who is in this picture, please?
This is taken up in Gözne, in the hills of a Taurus mountain. That is Salim Salman. His son is married to my youngest daughter, who is now living in Mersin. And we've got 2 children, Joseph, who's in Dubai, and Anna, who's living here in Southern Coalfield. That is Salim's sister, Saada. That's my mother, Theodosia Ricards. That's my grandmother, Mariam. And that is her sister's husband, Tannous Faris. He is Salim's father and my son-in-law, Samir's grandfather. So that's a very old picture of the two parts of the family.
What year and where was it taken?
This is up in Gözne. You can see the houses, very primitive in the hills, and it would probably be about 1940, 45, something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Now there have been 1 or 2 books published in Mersin. I've got an example here. This is published by Tülin Selvi Ünlü and her husband Tolga Ünlü.
Yeah.
And you've got a copy of
Yes,
these as well.
yes.
And so, did they contact you, these people?
Oh yes, I had an interview with that's one of the family houses in Mersin, and the big house here belonged to the Tahinci family. It was in fact built by Christmann. Christmann was the German consul who married into the Tahinci family and built the house. And a very old, very, very close friend of mine, we were only separated by 1 day, was called Fonda Tahinci, who died recently, sadly. The book is extremely comprehensive, and I have a feeling it sets out to show the harmony that existed in those times as between the local people and the incoming people, whether from the adjoining countries, the Arab world, or even from further afield, from Europe.
So it's like a testimony or a place of harmony and integration.
That's right, that's it.
So it's a very optimistic
that's it.
outcome.
Yeah.
And there's never been any strife, never been any riots.
No, never. No.
So,
No.
okay, and there is of course, since that book, another book has just been published
Yes.
as well, which I haven't got a copy yet, but
Yeah,
look
but
forward to
you
it.
told me about
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
okay. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And it was a nice little trip
My
down memory
pleasure. Yeah.
lane, and good luck with your
Yeah, and
new
thank
projects
you very much.
and,
Yeah, all
and
the
your
best.
new book.
Yeah.
Look forward to your book.
Inshallah.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Pleasure.